I thought I'd make a quick video about the Battle of Amiens because we're coming up to the anniversary of it, 8th of August 1918, and I believe it's Churchill that said something like, before Amiens there were no victories, after Amiens there were no defeats. It might have been someone else parodying Churchill saying about El Alamein, but this was true. And this is what, at least in the sort of Anglo-centric world, we talk about, heralding in the 100 days until the Germans surrender. In reality, the French had already done a lot of damage to the Germans 19 days or so before the Second Battle of the Marne, further south. And they've resisted German attacks, and then they'd hit back the Germans very hard and taken a lot of prisoners, something like 20,000, I believe. But why is the Battle of Amiens so important? For a number of reasons, really. It's the culmination of the all-arms battle. Up until this point, we've had individual innovations that we hope might be effective. We've improved the aircraft. We've attempted strategic bombing, even. We've had different things. We didn't even go into war with a functional hand grenade. We now got the Mills bomb. Trench mortars. Rifle grenades. We've had all these different innovations. Lewis guns. But at this point, it all comes together. And this is why this battle really spells the end for the Kaiser's Germany and Ludendorff and Hindenburg. Just to give some background, when we think about the First World War, we never had a continental army before that. We never went into a war with a massive continental army. Even at Waterloo, I believe something like 1 in 10 of the soldiers were actually British, when you count them up. We've never done continental armies with subscription and all this stuff. We've always been a sea power. That's why the Royal Navy is referred to as a senior service. And again, in the First World War, the Royal Navy's blockade was slowly choking Germany, and by this point it's really beginning to bite after food had been embargoed as an item of strategic importance. Germany has the turnip winter, things like this, when their potato crop fails and they're having to eat, roots and shoots and, all this stuff. Germany was being choked by the Royal Navy. And so did Britain really need to have a continental army there at all? That's something of a debate. Was it worth it ultimately? But that's for another day. But we'd seen the Somme fighting, obviously beginning for us on the 1st of July. We'd seen something like 420,000 casualties over the Somme fighting. Went on for several months. And it was very primitive because we weren't used to having a continental army. This wasn't the way we did things. We weren't that good at it. The French were far more effective. Even though they fought for longer, they only lost 2,000 only. 200,000, I get my numbers wrong. 200,000 on the Somme. We don't really know about German casualties. It's thought they might be anywhere between 400,000 to 600,000. And it certainly was an attritional battle for both sides. But when you look at them, most of them still have rifles. They're advancing pretty much in straight lines, big, long lines. The barrage went on for a week beforehand, and yet it wasn't hitting its targets. There were so many basic mistakes. And of course, the barrage stops, and then the Germans, and even the mines go off that have been dug, and then the Germans can know the attack's coming, then get out and lay down that heavy machine gun fire and artillery fire. It's a completely different war by 1918 because Britain has done its apprenticeship and the industry is fully tooled up. One of the big things about the Battle of Amiens is that now we're talking about the British Fourth Army, which is called British, but it's an Empire army. We'll go into details in a minute, but they no longer have to lug the guns between each army in each zone because the industry has been producing enough that they've got over 400 guns just for Rawlinson's Fourth Army. So they have the heavy howitzers there without having to move those around. The idea of secrecy, that the Germans don't know when you're going to attack. You haven't warned them beforehand. When you're bombarding a place with all your heavy guns for days beforehand and then it stops, you know that the attack's about to come. And sometimes even the Germans would taunt the British by throwing, I don't know how they would do it precisely, but they'd lob notes of some sort over saying, yeah, we're expecting you of, 2nd King's Own Rifles or something at 4:20 in the morning tomorrow. They would do things like this because we were using ground return telephones that just the earth wire on it was going through the ground and they could be tapped into. But now we have the fuller phone, which was not hackable in the same way. So there's innovations on many different levels. We know in the air over the Somme, Britain actually had some success, boom, boom. But then over Arras in 1917 had what was called Bloody April, where new generations of German fighters were far more effective. But by this point, in August of 1918, we've got the SE-5A has got over its teething troubles and it's now a dominant scout. And we've also got obviously a Sopwith Camel, which racks up more kills than any other, although it was a bit of a devil to fly because of the torque of the rotary engine. As you know, if you used to play Dawn Patrol like I did. But anyway, everything comes together at this point. So the attack is not going to have a massive preliminary bombardment. It's going to have a hurricane bombardment that just lasts a few minutes. And the purpose of that, obviously the reason why you have aircraft in the sky at all, the primary reason is to protect the artillery spotters. They spotted almost all the German gun emplacements. And now, because they've pre-registered the artillery, they can hit them on their first salvo. Well, not salvo round, but you know what I mean. They're hitting them. And even if they don't hit them directly, the purpose of the hurricane bombardment is to suppress the guns. So you make the crews run for cover. And this works very effectively. The guns that weren't destroyed were suppressed by firing near them, firing high explosive, then firing gas. And in terms of the men themselves, the way they were equipped, they obviously had bags of Mills bombs, grenades, but they had far more Lewis guns. They're going forward in little squads, so rather than having whole platoons and even, battalion level attacks, all these men in a long line going forth in waves, they don't do that anymore. They go forward in little groups, little squads of men, mimicking in a way the German tactics of Operation Michael that had begun some months before when the Germans had so much success. But they go forward in these little groups with, as I say, Lewis guns, so they've got a reasonably portable light machine gun there. And so the men that only have their rifles will be carrying more of the drums to stick on the Lewis gun. They have trench mortars, so even when they outstrip their own their own artillery, which is still always the issue, that it's so hard to move up artillery pieces, big heavy artillery pieces, over the churned up ground of no man's land. They still have their own portable artillery, so they have rifle grenades, especially reinforced rifles that can use a blank round to fire out a grenade much farther than a man can throw it, and also trench mortars, so little explosive mortars that they can carry forward, set up, and they have their own artillery, so they can take out machine gun positions using these kinds of weapons, and there's a lot more of them now. These things are readily available because it's an industrial war, it's total war. It's been total war since certainly 1916, all the retooling that took place then. And at this point, Britain is still an industrial powerhouse. So the Battle of Amiens, first of all, we had the Second Battle of the Marne. I think I might have mentioned that the French further south had repelled initial German attacks and then attacked themselves and taken a lot of prisoners, like 20,000. And so that begins this period of advancement by the Allies because the Germans are spent. They don't have enough food. Their industry is crippled by the blockade because it's really the Royal Navy that wins this war. We need to be quite clear about that. And they win the war by not losing it at Jutland. But anyway, we have, so this is up in sort of the more northern region of the Somme. We have Rawlinson's Fourth Army. This is really the army that's going to do the work. He has a corps under Butler, that's an English corps, and they are spent. They've been heavily mauled in the fighting of Operation Michael, and so their battalions are far fewer than they should be. And we've got to remember as well, in the English army system by this point, because Lloyd George said, "Oh, let's take on a bit more front from the French," we'd had to strip down from having 4 battalions to 3 in a brigade, and then 3 brigades to a division, but these were not full strength by any means. They might have been half strength, something like that. So they're exhausted, they're under strength, they've lost a lot of their leaders, and they've got the northern sector, which is the hardest terrain as well. There's a big craggy outcrop, which has a French name that I've forgotten, and even if I remembered it, I probably couldn't pronounce it, over where they are, so north of the Somme River. And further south, you have the Canadians under Curry, and then you have the Australians under Monash. Now, Monash didn't perform brilliantly in Gallipoli. He famously got lost once when he was leading a crucial night attack, things like this. But by this point, he's a very effective lieutenant general. So the Allies, they begin at, I think it was 4:20 in the morning, and they're assisted by the weather. There's a heavy fog rolling over, much as what happened when Operation Michael began for the Germans. It makes all the difference to have the weather in your favour. And there's the hurricane bombardment that just lasts 3 minutes. But all of those, I think it was something like 400 out of 420 German guns had been pre-sighted, and they could just shoot them off the map. They didn't need to register them actually where they were, because that would have alerted the Germans to the attack. And it's all been secret. I didn't mention this. All the preparations here. They had, apparently, even on the official documents that are being passed around, it had the words, "Keep your mouth shut," apparently to emphasise the secrecy. And so anyway, the hurricane bombardment begins, and then straight away the troops start moving forward. And by the time the Germans have reached their artillery pieces, those that haven't been smashed, and they try and... What they're used to previously is there's the bombardment, you take cover, then you get to your artillery pieces, and you rain fire down on the forward trenches. And they're still there, and all these men lining up, queuing up, ready to go. That wasn't the case here. They'd already got going. So the time worked perfectly, really. They fired on those guns that did fire on the British forward trenches, but the troops had already gone forward in these little sausage strings, as I described. And they pushed on, and the Germans were just surrendering. And it's reported that when the Germans, those that weren't taken prisoner, as they were sort of hurrying back away to avoid the British and the Commonwealth soldiers, they saw people going forward, being marshalled by their officers, and they were shouting at them, saying, "You're only prolonging the war. What are you doing?" Because at this point, Germany didn't really have any grand strategic objectives that it could realistically hope to obtain. It really only... They could have a limited victory, potentially, if they bled the English white and bled the French white, and if Operation Michael had reached the coast and taken the Channel ports. Yeah, it's a limited victory. But it's not going to lift the blockade. And the troops knew this by this point. They could see, when they looked to their rations, that Germany was starving and struggling when they got letters from home and all this stuff. So they were surrendering en masse, and they were running away if they could. And the British vastly outstripped the artillery cover. Normally, with what's called the bite and hold tactic, this is the idea that you go where you're still covered by your own artillery, and then you dig in and you wait for the obvious German counterattack, because German military doctrine is always that you counterattack. This was the case in World War I and World War II. You dig yourself in and you wait the inevitable counterattack, and then over time you wheel your big artillery pieces, your big howitzers forward, and then you do it again and again. But it's not a war-winning strategy really doing that, because there's great attrition, because the enemy will rain down artillery on you. This wasn't like that at all. What I should have said as well, despite the heavy howitzers with Hurricane bombardment, they also used field artillery, so lighter artillery pieces, to do a creeping barrage. So as the troops went forward, they had a barrage of shells covering them as well. So this was how organised it was. Whether that was even necessary, difficult to say, but that's what they did. There was also a creeping barrage across the front, so creating shell holes, creating chaos in front of it, and the soldiers keeping pace with that. So throughout, and the French First Army, which was guarding the right flank of the Aussies, that pushed forward as well a little later, but when it was clear that the Aussies were making tremendous progress, and we're talking miles here, the French First Army pushed forward as well, so as not to leave an exposed flank to the enemy. They were cautious, though, because they'd seen so many British big plans fail, that they actually wanted to wait and see, is this one going to work? And when they were certain it did, they pushed on. In terms of the depth of the penetration, I mean, what's the range of a heavy howitzer? It's 6,000 yards or so, but you probably sight it 1,000 yards or so behind the line. How many yards in a mile? We're talking about a range of, 2 or 3 miles? I've probably done the maths wrong there. But either way, they've gone much deeper than their artillery cover has taken them, and yet they're still flooding forward. They're still moving forward. Another innovation here, this is what allowed, I didn't mention this because I forgot, another innovation that allows the troops to push on as well as they did and as far as they did, and without having the massive preliminary bombardment, was the use of tanks. Now, tanks were not a war-winning weapon in World War I. They weren't reliable enough. They were basically blind, because when you're inside them, you can't really see anything. You're engulfed with carbon monoxide and smoke and gasoline and all this stuff, and the crew's vomiting after a few minutes. It's pretty unpleasant. Plus, they're big targets for artillery. But there were lots of them. There were, I think, between 400 and 500 of these heavier Mark V tanks, and also the lighter Whippet tanks, which supposedly could, keep up just about with a trotting horse. But none of them performed that well. But what they did do was flatten the barbed wire. And previously, this was the problem, particularly at the Somme, not cutting through the barbed wire. They only had high explosives, and that just throws it up in the air and it comes down again. You need effective shrapnel shells with the 106 fuses on it, the one that we copied off the French, so it explodes on contact. That's how we're cutting the barbed wire eventually. After 1917, when that fuse came in, it touched the barbed wire, the shrapnel would go off and it would cut the barbed wire. Here, there was less of a need for that because there were so many tanks, and they could, if nothing else, flatten barbed wire. And also, they would attract the gunfire, because you've got a massive tank coming at you with big, not naval guns, but, well, I guess they were really. Small naval guns, if we're naval terms. But yeah, blasting at you. The remaining gun positions, and, you are going to attract fire. So tanks... the troops were not always keen to walk near tanks and walk behind tanks because they were magnets for fire. And after the attack, on the first day, most of them were out of action from mechanical problems, and some have been taken out. They were extremely unreliable, and no suspension as well. There's a famous video of a tank being presented to the king, and it goes sort of down in this trench and comes up the other side, and it kind of smashes around a bit, and to be fair, it pops out, and the crew gets out, but there's only like 3 of them, and the reason was the rest were unconscious inside it because I had no suspension, and they were getting thrown around and they all hit their heads. But so they were, they were a blunt, blind instrument, but useful for crushing barbed wire, which was a big problem. I mean, you try and climb over some barbed wire when you're not under fire, you just want to go through a field. You're pretty careful, aren't you? So the Aussies and the Canadians push on something like 8 miles, so a very deep penetration. The British under Butler in the north, because of that rocky outcrop where the Germans had good sight and everything else, a good position to place their artillery, the British only made a couple of miles of progress, and because the troops were spent. They were not at full strength, whereas the other Canadians, the Australians, were full strength, and they had full 4 battalions to a brigade, so their divisions were stronger as well for that reason. And particularly the Canadians had an excellent backup system of training troops and sending them over to replace losses. So they were strong, and Curry was a brilliant general as well, it should be said. Anyway, the other key with this battle is that the British knew when to stop, because we saw at Passchendaele, well, I shouldn't call it Passchendaele, the Third Ypres, which we often call Passchendaele, it's just a small part of it, but when it bogged down in the mud, and it was just becoming a grinding battle of attrition where both sides were losing men, even to silly things like drowning in mud. I say silly, pretty grotesque really, drowning in mud. Not particularly clean mud as well, I'd vouchsafe, but we ground and ground and ground on. And, Foch, who at this point was the generalissimo, he was the general in charge of all the Allies, he wanted not Rawlinson, he wanted General Haig to tell Rawlinson to keep pressing, keep pushing, keep pushing. And Haig, to his great credit, wonderful general, not a butcher, not at all, very intelligent man. Haig said no. He said, we've outstripped the artillery, it's going to take days and days to get the artillery forward, build roads, let the troops rest, all the rest of the logistic preparations that you need for a big offensive. We're not going to do it. And Foch didn't like that, because he thought the Germans were about to crack, and indeed they were cracking. But Haig was reasonable, and he stopped the offensive after a few days, and then they switched the attack. And for the last 100 days, it was a case of poking the Germans all over the place, because the difference with the Germans, they were getting reinforcements from the Eastern Front, because obviously Russia had under the the Red Communists had already capitulated, so the Germans were able to bring back some troops, although they still need to keep a fair few there, because they're a bit unpredictable, those commies. But they would bring back troops, and they were reinforcing, and indeed they reinforced the Amiens sector massively. But the British and the Allied command knew that the Germans were near breaking point, but also just in terms of logistics, in terms of things like food, in terms of fuel, and all the things you need to run a campaign, the best thing to do actually was to press them somewhere totally different. Only you'll exhaust their troops, because they're having to shuffle the same troops around to try and reinforce wherever you're attacking, whereas we could attack anywhere. And indeed, that is what happened for the last 100 days. So I'm trying to think if I've mentioned everything. We didn't talk much about the air war. By this point, there's a good book by Peter Hart called Aces Falling. By this point, most of the aces have suffered with post-traumatic stress disorder, or I say post-traumatic, I mean it's during the trauma really, isn't it? Most of them have fallen by this point. And the air war was certainly important. The British were attempting strategic bombing. Well, I suppose, what strategic bombing, is that the right term? Maybe tactical bombing, really. But certainly trying to attack marshalling yards and railways and things like this behind the Amiens sector of the Somme to try and stop the Germans reinforcing it. So they were bombing, but it wasn't very effective. But the key was that the Allies were becoming dominant in the air, and artillery spotting was still vital because, as well, okay, you obviously take the photographs beforehand, pick out various strong points you need to attack, and artillery batteries and so on. But even during the battle, you need people flying above it so that they can then send you real-time information. They can put in what's called zone calls, where they say, hey, there's a piece that we thought was suppressed or we didn't know about, but it's here, and you need to deluge that with gas or deluge that with high explosive. And they are able to do this. So the air war certainly came into it. So it was the all-arms battle. And it was the culmination of development throughout the war. It had been a sharp learning curve for everybody. And of course, it's not just you that's learning, it's the Germans that are learning as well. They're all getting better. And it's been said that a soldier in 1914 would not recognise this battle of 1918. Maybe not even a soldier in 1916 would recognise it because of the progress, if you can call it progress, the progress in the ability to kill. But yeah, stunning victory, often just attributed to Monash. But, the Aussies certainly played a key role, as did the Canadians. And we should probably conclude what Ludendorff said after this. He called it the Black Day of the German Army, which is something we like to quote. But let's be honest, really the Second Battle of the Marne could just as well have been called that, which was a French-led affair, although British troops were involved. There were a few British divisions there as well. It was an Allied effort, but at this point, even Ludendorff, who was always confident, always scheming, he had to realise now it was only a matter of time before the end came, and unfortunately he still prolonged it for another 100 days. And then, before the surrender, he demanded an armistice. He said, we can't fight anymore. We just need, we need to stop this. Can't function anymore, and the Allies will be in Germany unless we stop. And then, of course, he skedaddled and left it to the politicians to give rise to the stab in the back myth, which unfortunately was a key belief of the Nazis in the Second World War. And had it not been for the stab in the back myth, maybe they wouldn't have gained so much traction. But that's a talk for another day. We've rambled on long enough. Battle of Amiens, 8th of August 1918.